Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Politico podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ray Hennessy, and today we're joined with a very, very special guest.
Micheal Doyle. I'm an adjunct professorial lecturer here at the School of Media and Public Affairs and a full-time reporter for E&E News.
Thank you for coming on today.
My pleasure.
And I'm very excited to talk about, especially the world of journalism. As you can tell, very recently, there's been a big shakeup, especially with the White House and how things are done, and how a lot of what you cover, especially I remember you talk about, you cover a lot of the Department of the Interior,
That's right,
wildlife and conservation. A lot of change up is going on. A lot of things are changing. But before we go into that, I kind of want to go take a step back and talk about your journey into journalism, how you started. Because when you first started, first started working, at least according to your LinkedIn, you worked as a farmhand, correct?
Right. I graduated from Oberlin College with a degree in government, and I'd worked for the school paper. They don't have a journalism program per se, but I always liked writing, and reporting was a fun way to get published on a regular basis. After college, I came here to the Washington, D.C. area to work on a farm called the Potomac Vegetable Farm. It's still in existence out Route 7. And I worked there for a year and a half before I moved back to California and slowly made my way into reporting, working full-time to make money as a tree surveyor and as a technical writer, while picking away at the freelance world of newspaper writing, first as a contract writer and then eventually as a staff writer in Palo Alto. And once I had my feet in the door, I refused to leave the room and just kept moving from position to position until I came back here to D.C.
Mm-hmm. And even when you were in college, were you writing mostly about environmental issues or stuff like that? What were you writing about?
I was writing about Ultimate Frisbee because I was an Ultimate Frisbee player. I was writing about assignments, the new computer system that was bought by the college. And that was one of the eye-opening moments for me that I think turned me on to journalism. In my first probably week at school, I joined up with the Oberlin Review, and the editor assigned me a story about the new computer system. And I said, well, how do I report that? And he said, well, go to the college president's office and maybe he'll talk to you. So I thought, I'm just a little freshman, they wouldn't talk to me. So I went to the college president's office, and the secretary said, President Fuller is right in there in that room. Why don't you go on in? And he was a young man, and he had long hair. He's a physicist and a brilliant, controversial guy. And he welcomed me to his room. In my first week, I was talking to the president of the college, and I thought, how cool is this job to have a position where people will invite you in and talk to you? So from there, I did write about environmental issues, did an early enterprise piece about the trees of Oberlin and the politics behind their planting. So that was consistent with my own interest as an outdoors type person.
There were politics behind trees being planted?
Yeah, you wouldn't believe it. It was my first really big fun story. A biology professor had turned me on to the question of where do the trees come from. On the center of town is called Tappan Square. So I went to the Oberlin archives to track down the history, and that itself opened my eyes to the availability of documents. And in the paper trail about the plantings, it turned out that the politically powerful secretary of the college wanted elm trees planted. The botany professor in the 1920s said, that's a bad idea, Mr. Secretary, because there's this new disease. It's been found on the East Coast. It's called Dutch elm disease, and it's going to wipe out trees. And if you plant elms, they'll last for 10 years, and then they'll be destroyed. And the secretary said, you stick to your butterflies, Professor, we'll take care of this. So they planted the trees because of the internal political clout of the man who wanted them, and sure enough, they were beautiful until they were dead. So yes, there's politics behind everything is one thing that I did learn.
Oh, that's interesting. I think the last time I read a political article about trees, it was or maybe not watched, it was, it was watched. It was the Tucker Carlson talking about some liberal trees on campus. So that's really funny seeing that trees have always been a topic of politicization. I want to take a step back and talk about, you said Dutch elm disease. It's true that you were a Dutch elm disease project surveyor for the California Department of Food and Agriculture, correct?
Yeah, so when I was trying to make my way into reporting full time, I needed to make money, and one of my first jobs was there was a Dutch elm surveying project, trying to root out trees, identify trees that had the disease. So I signed up for a 6-month stint, and it was pretty cool. They gave us a uniform, and they assigned me, for unknown reasons, to drive one of the big High Ranger trucks. So me and my partner Steve would drive through the San Francisco Bay Area, identify trees that could be diseased, park the truck, shoot the stick up 75 feet, then take samples of the tree and take them down. And it was a job that neither of us were at all qualified for. I did crash the truck once as we were driving through a rich neighborhood called Atherton. But it was eye-opening, and it paid the bills, and it did expose me to the, as we were talking about the political aspect of of agriculture and trees, because in this case there was a political impetus to get rid of the disease before it spread, community-wide.
Was this like a serious, like, because I haven't heard of Dutch elm disease before. Was this like a serious thing
We
at
did
the
a good job in wiping it out.
Okay, fair enough. Was it like a very quick spreading, serious like problem?
Yes, it was a chronic problem.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, what became more politically incendiary was, at that same time, there was what was called the medfly infestation.
Mm-hmm.
Medfly stands, or is short for Mediterranean fruit fly, and it spreads very quickly. It's an insect, and it can wipe out any number of specialty crops. And in California, where specialty crops are $1 billion industry, the necessity of clamping down on the spread of medflies is highly significant. So actually, we began doing some side work on the medfly project as well.
That I guess kind of shows that there's always been problems with infestations. I know, like nowadays we have the red lantern flies. Especially, I'm from New Jersey.
Okay.
That's like a massive problem. I remember like 2 years ago, when I was like touring universities, they were just like stacked up by the hundreds when I was in New Brunswick. It was terrible. It was like disgusting. And I remember, there was like the campaign to like step on them, and you end up having like these giant, just like piles worth, like on the street corners. It was.
Well, and it raises any campaign against invasive species can invoke important questions of public health. And in the case of the Mediterranean fruit fly, more than Dutch elm, the politically potent farm industry in California wanted to spray a pesticide called malathion to wipe out the insect. The communities that would be sprayed in Palo Alto, which were very rich communities and hence had some commensurately strong political influence in Sacramento, didn't want the residents sprayed with the poison. So there was a considerable struggle. And I think that was my first exposure, because I was writing for the Palo Alto Weekly as a freelancer at the time, my first exposure to the clash of interests, in this case, between the agriculture industry that wants to spray and the community of residents who want to avoid getting poisoned.
Huh. That's... Is that tends to be a common occurrence when it comes to like addressing these kinds of issues, where like
conflict over resources is the eternal issue, which has been the center of my reporting really for a long time. When I came to Washington D.C. in the McClatchy Newspapers Bureau, writing primarily at first for the Fresno Bee and Modesto and Sacramento Bee newspapers, one of the key issues was the allocation of water. And in that case, farmers wanted water diverted to the crops, and environmentalists and other resource advocates wanting water, retained in the rivers for the sake of salmon and endangered species. So conflict over resources is inherent and everlasting.
Excuse my ignorance if I mischaracterize. I'm curious in talking about water rights. In California, I think it was they blew a couple dams to have water flow to more like traditional areas and stuff like that throughout the countryside. I'm curious what your thoughts on that were and the impacts of that.
Well, there are a couple of things going on. Damming up one of the great stories of the colonization of the West involves the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation and their construction of dams and building of infrastructure to deliver water from where it started to to municipalities and to farms, and in the course of doing so, made the West bloom and also destroyed river runs and habitat for species like salmon and so on. And so that was counterbalanced with the environmental movement, perhaps beginning in the 1960s and 70s, to reallocate, redistribute water. And as part of that, there was a proposal to get rid of some dams up in the Klamath Basin and Northern California and Oregon and in Maine and a few other locations. To do that, it's very complicated and it's expensive. And to critics, it's a waste of water, sending water down into the ocean instead of to where it belongs with farms. So it's and this is going on right now. In the Klamath Basin, there are four dams that were targeted for elimination. I think just in the last year, the first of them was taken down, and there's still years after this was authorized opposition to it.
Well, then what's the argument that was supporting the idea of getting rid of the dams? Or these certain dams?
Well, it's to restore habitat for endangered species, salmon and other fish that rely upon the rivers. When the rivers were being diverted to irrigation purposes, the salmon lacked the habitat to survive. And so, because the society, through its political representatives, had placed a value on habitat restoration and specific species under the Endangered Species Act and other measures, that society decided that it's worth the cost to protect these species and the habitat that they rely upon. So that is an enduring fight. And so right now, stepping up to the Trump administration, dominated by interest that want to support the resources being diverted to energy production and agricultural production, and this is going to be the conflict that we face over the next 4 years.
Yeah, I definitely it's going to be a big debate. I remember seeing there was a protest at Yosemite where they put the flag upside down at El Capitan.
Yeah, there was a slightly different issue, but it was an absolutely remarkable moment for those who haven't seen the picture. In fact, when I first saw it, I thought it was photoshopped, because it was so extraordinary. There's El Capitan, which is this great massive rock face, famous mostly for its grandeur, its beauty, and the men and women who climb it.
Have you ever been there?
I've never climbed it, but I've been there, several times, and it's absolutely stunning. And from the top, I don't know how they did it, but apparently Park Service workers or former Park Service workers or their supporters had draped a massive American flag. And it was a sign of not so much of resource protest, but of protesting the Trump administration's wholesale staffing and probable resource declines for national parks.
Yeah, I was reading into it. I think he's gonna well, it's my understanding that the National Park Service tends to be usually underfunded relative to what they need to do for their conservation efforts. Is that true?
Every agency is underfunded, if you ask them. But certainly the National Park Service has long-standing deferred maintenance backlog. It's billions of dollars of work that needs to be done. Another sister agency in the Department of the Interior, the Fish and Wildlife Service, is underfunded, and as a result of this lack of resources, decisions are delayed in protecting species and in protecting habitat. And that fear that we're not devoting enough resources to this natural resource protection will be aggravated during the Trump administration, where they have different priorities and are also reducing staff. So what are already long delays in decisions will be aggravated. What are already long waiting lines for deferred maintenance will get longer as well.
And do you think, because I remember seeing on Instagram when Trump was elected, there was a lot of people posting on Instagram bye-bye national parks. I don't necessarily know if I believe the hype of whether or not, but do you think it's very plausible that resource extraction and stuff might start encroaching into national parks?
Absolutely. I mean, and this is not a value judgment. I as a reporter, I do my best to steer clear of taking positions, but just taking at face value, the Trump administration's priorities are resource extraction. They want to make the Trump administration leaders talk without any hesitation about making this an energy dominant nation, lifting the restrictions, whether they be environmental or other restrictions on the ability to extract, whether it's critical minerals or water for agriculture. So you'll hear what to me sound like alarming statements of bye-bye national parks. And that's, I think, you can criticize what sound like extreme statements. It's undeniable that the conflict is over resources is going to be very vocal over the next couple of years.
But does it really seem, because it seems like, the country is massive. Is it really necessary for like the Trump administration, if they need more resources, that they have to go into the national parks first and start extracting?
Well, I to be clear, it's not so much that they'll go into national parks. Once a national park is established, there are certain limits,
right.
Or once wilderness is designated, there are certain limits. But there, as an example of what does happen, is at the end of the Obama end of the Obama administration, certain monuments in this U.S. Southwest, in Utah and Colorado, were established, which carved out from the landscape land which would not be accessible for resource extraction. When the first Trump administration came in, those monuments were shrunk by hundreds of thousands of acres. So what is a designated wilderness or park retains their protection, but the areas that are designated as such can change. But having said that, there's no doubt that the Trump administration wants to do exactly this. They want to, for instance, in Nevada, there are several proposals for lithium mines. Lithium is important, critical mineral for batteries, EV cars, and so on. Mm-hmm. And precisely where these mines are located, or where they're proposed to be located, there are endangered plants like Team's buckwheat, a tiny plant, yay big, very obscure. Most of us have never heard of it or seen it, yet it's designated as protected, and that causes the mining operations to incur expenses to protect them, and that is a conflict that the Trump administration wants to tilt the resolution of it toward the extraction of rather than the protection of resources.
What would be the argument against, because I hear this a lot from people who want to do more drilling, want to do more industrial production. They say that, yeah, it's important to protect these plants, it's important to protect endangered species, but a lot of the regulations to protect these environmental concerns, they're either over-regulated, or there's a lot of redundancies in the regulation, ends up slowing things down and ends up making things a lot more challenging than it really should be.
Well, it's a legitimate argument. For me, I tend to be, although I try not to take positions in public, as a general rule, I consider myself a pragmatist, mm-hmm. and hence the kind of extreme sounding rhetoric from both sides seems to be the mark of people who are unwilling to concede that in the case of resource protection, laws like the Endangered Species Act have not been updated in several decades. In some cases, their implementation have caused the perhaps unnecessary, undue delay in projects, the addition of additional and unnecessary expenses. And it would be appropriate to look at whether there are ways to streamline permitting process. Permitting under the National Environmental Protection Act and other laws requires a certain amount of study, and pragmatic, conservation-minded people will concede that the permitting takes too long, and that adds to the expense and causes the industry to go overseas and so on. So it's, I think, a very legitimate point to make that there's excessive delay and excessive impediments by the bureaucracy. You have to wonder, right now we're facing a massive layoff of personnel from the permitting agencies, the perverse effect of which would be presumably to increase, not decrease, the time it takes to get a permit done. Mm-hmm. And so the very administration that wants to speed up permitting is making that harder because it's cutting staff willy-nilly.
And speaking of the current administration, you currently write for E&D News by Politico, correct?
That's right.
Right. And I can imagine Politico is one of the media companies that's affected by the current Trump press pool shakeup.
Well, yes, in several respects. Several weeks ago, Elon Musk, the Department of Government Efficiency operator, and his team were looking at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and discovering that information that was available publicly all along, it was no secret,
Right.
but that USAID and other government agencies were subscribers to Politico, which is the parent company, and E&E News, which I work for directly.
Hidden subsidies.
so called, and the first reporting was quite misleading. There was a suggestion that USAID spent $8 million a year for subscriptions to Politico. It turns out that was the total government cost. And in retaliation for our coverage, I think, and as a sign of sticking it to the press man, the Trump administration proceeded to cancel the E&E and Politico subscriptions, and so and did so in a very public way. President Trump said words to the effect of, "Yeah, we're cutting the subsidy to this, radical far left agendas driving media," which is like, no, we're not. But that seems to be their approach. So that's one very direct assault by the Trump administration on my company. But you mentioned the White House pool, which is a different issue.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. So the certain just to clarify, certain bureaus would be paying for their employees subscriptions to Politico.
That's right. So Politico and E&E News have a very successful business model, and that's based not so much on revenue from advertising, but from subscriptions. And subscribers pay for incremental, highly detailed, really smart, analytically driven, and very timely information, whether it's on energy and environment issues from E&E or political policy issues from Politico. And so different government agencies would find it very important to have subscription. And so, yes, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Energy Department, EPA, would all have their separate subscriptions. And it totaled for Politico/E&E, I think the numbers were about $8 million a year was paid from the government to my companies for government workers as it was told to me when I first started with them in 2017, that government agencies will subscribe to know what other government agencies are doing, which is sort of peculiar, but that was the way it worked.
So this has been something that's been going on for a while, like having a large readership within the government.
Oh, it's at the center of the business model.
But then I wonder, how much did that hurt the business?
Well, that's a great question. We've, just frontline reporters like myself have asked that. The message from leadership at Politico and E&E is that it obviously is not fun when $8 million a year in revenue is taken out, but that we have a very stable model that depends on other subscribers. There's also revenue from other sources through conferences and so on. And so we're withstanding the storm right now, but there's no denying that there has been a hit.
Do you think that, given the value of like E&D and Politico in general, bureaus might buy back in, or do you think under the Trump administration this might not happen?
Well, it's funny. In the first Trump administration, individual cabinet members, in particular the head of EPA, got really unhappy at our coverage, which was aggressive and smart and insightful, and all the things that he didn't like. This is EPA Administrator Wheeler. So he, in a fit of pique and retaliation, he unilaterally cut EPA subscriptions. And
so this happened before
on a smaller level. And what happened was that the EPA workers lost out in the information flow. This is an information-driven, government we're in. And so slowly, after being shut out from subscriptions, they began buying in, a small unit at a time until eventually everybody was lined back up. But that was just individual agencies. Now it's a government-wide prohibition. One thing that Politico has started is they have a term for it, I forget, but it's like a gift subscription, that if you used to subscribe and you work for the government, you can have a 3-month free subscription. And so you don't pay for it, so there's no cost to the government, but it'll keep you in the information loop.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like the short kind of Band-Aid fix for now.
Band-Aid fix, because it's, as far as I know, in fact, by design, there's no revenue from it. There's no subscription cost. Right. But the idea is to keep people linked in, so they don't lose the habit of coming to us for their information needs. And perhaps over time, the thought is that the Trump administration officials will see reason and stop shooting themselves in the foot information-wise and come back to us.
Because right now it's not just it's a prohibition, as in the government, like, workers cannot have it.
The terms may be slightly different technically, but they've canceled every federal agency, to my knowledge, has canceled its subscriptions to Politico and E&E News.
All right, and then transitioning now to the press pool shake-up. Some people have called it a media ban. Some people say it's a shake-up. What's the best terminology when looking at this, and what is it?
Well, first, to be clear, so the White House pool is the highest profile example of pool coverage. Pool coverage means that when there's limited access available to an event, whether it's a sporting event or a White House event, the media at large is represented by the pool, which is a small subset of the overall media team that are assigned the responsibility of going to the event, getting into the small room, and reporting back to the larger operatives. Mm-hmm. And so that's the pool. The White House press pool is the highest profile example of that. And for decades, the distribution of the members of the pool were decided by the White House Correspondents Association, and there's essentially a rotation was set up so that there'd always be a wire service reporter from the Associated Press, there'd be photographers, and then members of the White House permanent reporting group would rotate. So when I was at the McClatchy newspapers, McClatchy was part of the rotation, and Politico is currently part of the rotation. So the change that the Trump administration imposed was to decide that the White House, not the White House correspondents themselves, will decide who's member of the pool. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, I think the presumption is, if they haven't already begun it, is that the One American News, the Washington Examiner, and other information organizations with a slant toward the conservative perspective will be allowed in. And the White House argument is similar to, there's a similar move at the Pentagon, which took permanent press office spaces that have been long inhabited by the Los Angeles Times and others, and gave them to conservative news / conservative perspective organizations. And so now we have a situation where neutral institutions devoted to straight news reporting are being replaced and denied access in favor of what might be called propaganda arms.
And please excuse my coughing. I don't know where it's coming from. Yeah, it's definitely interesting because the argument seems to be this politicization and almost control of news flow, picking out who has the right to actually be in the rooms to actually cover the White House is a very interesting argument, or a very interesting conversation to have. That being said, I have heard through like podcasts, through some alternative media, that there is an argument that this might be a good thing. Maybe not the fact that Trump is picking more conservative, more kindly news outlets, but that a shakeup was somewhat needed. I remember seeing a podcast. Are you familiar with the Lex Friedman podcast?
I've heard of it, but I've never heard it.
Yeah, so he has a podcast. It's big on YouTube, and he had one newscaster, Sagar Enjeti, who's host of like this on like YouTube show called Breaking Points, and he brought up this interesting where the way the White House like the way the White House press conferences are done is that the Associated Press, and this is like kind of a holdover from legacy because the system was created under, I believe, Eisenhower, and the White House, what's it called, the WHCA, the White House Correspondence, I think was created in 1914. So this has been, a long time. And one of the holdovers of the system was that the Associated Press always gets to ask the first question, and they always get to ask the last question and kind of end it when they want.
Yeah, a lot of encrusted tradition had been built up around White House coverage, and that included who asked the first question, who asked the last question, who's a member of the pool, and honestly, I think there's a really strong argument that some shakeup is appropriate, that the legacy media, Dead Tree newspapers and others, don't have a birthright or a constitutional right to proximity to the president, that there are podcasters and social influencers and others that are frankly of greater importance in the media ecosystem.
Do you think Joe Rogan should be up there?
I don't see why not. He's an incredibly intelligent, insightful, and of course, first and foremost, widely read and consequently very influential conveyor of information, as was and President Trump, then candidate Trump's appearance for 2 hours or 3 hours on a show that his opponent would not appear on. I think it exemplified that. There's a new sheriff in town. Whether Joe Rogan himself would be an appropriate member of the White House correspondence team, I'm not sure about that. But I think that shakeup is a positive thing.
Interesting,
honestly, and I think moving in some social influence or social media types, digital native types into the coverage is a timely recognition that how people get their information has changed. I think that where the White House goes wrong is to then be not simply replacing one institution with another, but replacing a putatively neutral news organization with a assertively advocacy-oriented organization. And so that's moving away from reporting on the White House to amplifying the White House message, which I think is problematic.
But do you think this could be chalked up to, in some sense, a media ban, or is that kind of exaggerated language?
Well, it depends. I mean, this fight at the pool, about the White House pool, I think sort of got its start most immediately or most recently when the Associated Press was denied access to a pool event. And this is before the White House decided to change how the pool was allocated. And the White House said, essentially, among other things, you can still cover the event. The Associated Press, like a news organization not part of the pool, can get the pool information and call their sources, and it's not a ban. There's no penalty imposed. It just made it harder to get the access that you're accustomed to. So I think this struck, the White House move struck at the heartbeat of the journalism business and was clearly motivated by animus. And there was a retaliatory element to it, which makes it hard to see is there merit, is there some underlying merit to the idea. I mean, my view is that there is underlying merit to the idea of shaking up how the pool is operated and which media organizations are represented. I think that the motive behind doing that is not virtuous. I think it's malicious, and so to that extent, I oppose it.
But then also, to what extent, how important is the makeup of the pool? Can they really, alter the information or the way that it's being displayed? Like, what's their degree of actual sway?
Well, that's a great question. And as an example of an answer is we can look at what happened in the extraordinary meeting on Friday, this last week, the extraordinary meeting last week with President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. And the people in the room were part of the pool operation. And so they're the ones that asked the questions. And so the fact that one of the pool members, I forget the organization, but it was a Trump-friendly news organization, took the incredibly valuable opportunity of asking a question to ask President Zelensky, is it appropriate? Do you own a suit, or do you think this make sense? Does this show respect to wear this jogging suit to the Oval Office? And it was clearly a hostile question, clearly driven by an effort to buttress the Trump administration's perspective. And it's not the sort of thing, I don't think, that would be asked by a straight-up news organization. So yes, I thought that was an example of how the makeup of the pool can make a difference. It makes a difference in what questions get asked, and hence what answers are provided, and how what direction the news takes for that day.
And then deciding, however, what is an actually, objective source. I mean, this will be a debate without an end, because obviously those who are fans of Trump think that, the nominally objective sources, the New York Times, Politico, it's a bunch of evil liberals who are,
it's got it right.
and obviously people on the left would say that these sources that the right would call, the bearers of truth are, obviously biased and pro-Trump. Where is that medium where you do get the shakeup, but you don't have this argument? Because I feel like no matter who would end up shaking up the system, it'll just be, accusal of you're putting in your own lackeys, your own supporters.
Yeah, this is the eternal fight, and there will be no permanent resolution. There's an inherent conflict between institutions and those that report on them. There is one definition of news, which is news is that which someone doesn't want you to read. Everything else is public relations. And I think that goes too far, but I think it does speak to the fact that there has to be a conflict between what a government entity does and what the relationship with the press is to it. So what we see with the Trump administration tension, it's not unique to them. Speaking as someone who has covered several administrations, and they're on both every issue and most recently on the environment, the Democratic administrations could be just as hostile, could be just as recalcitrant, could be just as obnoxious in their denial of information.
Could you give an example of this?
Yes. One of the issues that I covered when I was with the McClatchy newspaper chain, writing for the Fresno Bee, was what was called the Armenian Genocide Resolution. This was an effort to get Congress to pass a resolution commemorating what is now recognized as the Armenian genocide. This was an issue important to my papers because Fresno has a large Armenian population. It became a political issue because Turkey says that there was no genocide. There was a war. The number of Armenians dead were exaggerated. And by the way, Congress, if you pass this resolution, we will block your access to NATO air bases, and we won't buy helicopters from Bell Helicopters in Texas. So tight political fighting. And when I tried to get, in this case, the Democratic White House to answer questions, they would slow walk the answers until the debate time was over. They would either not respond to questions, or they would give me non-responsive answers. And that happens all the time. The Interior Department during the Biden administration continued what has been a trend of centralizing information. So I might have a question about an endangered species decision. I would ask the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they would kick it to the main Interior Department, which would control the flow of information. And that was, from an ostensibly liberal or left-center administration, but their view toward controlling what people know and how they know it was every bit as restrictive as the Republicans.
Well, I think it would make sense, when you're in control of the institution. I don't think any party is completely, honest or, doing as their values. So it naturally comes with it that they're going to be very careful with what they give out.
Yeah, I mean, everybody curates their own reputation,
Right.
and you wouldn't expect someone on a social media site to include their enemies talking about how bogus they are, and so it makes sense that an institution will do its best to present put its best foot forward. Uh, there hopefully are limits to that. Hopefully that if there are dissident views from within the government about that foot being put forward, those dissidents will not be punished overtly. And that's one thing that we see with the Trump administration, I think, in a way that we hadn't to this degree with prior administrations, is that there is a widespread fear right now. I will extrapolate from the Interior Department, widespread fear among career employees that if they are seen as being close to or a source of information for the press, their jobs will be at jeopardy.
And do you think this is a new phenomenon under Trump?
I think it's a far greater degree than. I mean, the Obama administration prosecuted people sent someone to jail, at least one former CIA officer to jail, to prison, for the leaking of information, the unauthorized disclosure of information. The Obama administration was quite severe in its handling of information flow and sought to restrict it. And was pretty aggressive in some high-profile ways of spinning its story. So, for instance, there was a movie, a really fine movie, Zero Dark 30, about the assassination of Osama bin Laden by Navy SEAL Team 6, and it came out that the Obama White House gave assistance to the filmmakers because this was a success, seen as a success for the administration. And so they are, on the one hand, providing privileged access to the CIA and the Pentagon for the positive message, we killed Osama bin Laden, and sending people to jail for sending other messages like we've been torturing people that we capture. And that was under the Democrats. I think what's changed is the aggressiveness with which the anti-media policy takes hold in the administration.
Do you think that with the emergence of all these new alternative media and like social media and just like the freedom of the internet, do you think that has caused the governments to be more safeguarded, more I don't want the term schizophrenic, but a little bit more like conscious of the information flow?
That's a good question. I mean, I would answer it this way, that as a result of the social media revolution, everybody, the definition of media is now expanded. So everybody's their own reporter, everybody is their own publisher. It's so much easier now to transmit information widely, and it's not just the legacy institutions, legacy media companies that can make information public. And so as a result, I suppose that does make the institutions more cognizant of the fact that there are other ways that information is getting out there. Has it made them more likely to clamp down on the information? I can't think of an example. It makes sense that it would. If the government feels that there are more opportunities for the information to leak out, more venues for it to leak out to, then they could well impose greater restrictions.
I mean, it would make sense because when I think about it, it's like, maybe in the past, if a government employee was not happy with the way things were, they would have to go to a whistleblower, give files. But now it's like I could just take a picture on my phone or a video on my phone and send it to someone, maybe WikiLeaks, and then it's out there.
Yeah, that's right. But this puts me in mind that, of course, we've been focusing on the government institutions that curate their reputation and restrict access. But it's not just them. Sports teams, as an adjunct instructor at the School of Media and Public Affairs, I like to send my students out to cover events in the real world, and sometimes I've assigned stories on the sports. Do a sports story, and in doing that, the students and I discovered that, and not just at GW. Division I athletes are often advised or often directed not to talk to the press. That the team and the athletic department want to funnel the information about a particular sport through authorized channels out of a possible fear of dissonant messages going out. Is that increasing or decreasing? I don't know, but it's just an example of the fact that it's not just political institutions, it's educational institutions, it's sports institutions, I think almost the definition of institution is one that seeks to protect its reputation, and it does that by controlling the flow of where that goes and how it goes. So all that is to say, with more nodes of information, more people able to publish, the institution has to spread its cloak of secrecy even wider.
That being said, though, I feel like there was a high point. I think it's called like what, gonzo journalism or like ambush journalism. Mud racking has always been a thing. It just seems that there was a period of time where I think people were not fully privy to the degree of which social media was could be used to kind of expose someone with like hidden cameras or like secret meetings and stuff like that.
Well, some people have made their career out of it. Jesse Waters, the obnoxious Fox News guy, got his start, if I remember right, as Bill O'Reilly's hatchet man. He would be assigned with the camera, and he'd go, and they were pretty entertaining. And in a way, I thought it was legit. They would Waters or people like him would approach a public figure and, like, as they're walking from the Rayburn House Office Building to the Capitol to vote, and there's in this case, a Democratic member of Congress, and the social media assault force would ask embarrassing questions, and hopefully from their perspective get a video of the member of Congress, acting rude, shoving the camera out of the way, and so it made a good social media moment, and that I think had its high point when people had not yet really acknowledged or recognized the fact that every person with a phone is a publisher of information, and so you have to be on the lookout.
And then, kind of zooming out, what do you think is the future direction of journalism? When it seems to be becoming a lot more democratized, legacy media seems to have less of a hold on information, the outflow of it. What is the future looking like?
Well, I mean, to answer that question is to emphasize what had been a mass media is now fractured, and it's a multipolar media world. When I started as a reporter, it was with the Dead Tree Press. So I wrote first for a weekly newspaper, and that is now a news cycle that's almost hard to imagine now because things happen and they're instantly reported. But it was a more leisurely pace than I was working for a daily newspapers. And even that, in hindsight, seemed like a very leisurely pace. And that, of course, transformed as newspapers died, Dead Tree newspapers died, circulation shrunk, and people began turning off news and looking to Instagram or other social media sources. So the future is depending on what part of the media you're talking about. For podcasters, I think the future is fantastic. It's because podcasts like this give a chance for people to be exposed to fascinating individuals like myself, and then listen to it, at their leisure. My wife is a huge podcast fan, and she's always discovering new ones, and she listens as she's doing chores or gardening around the house. And so I think podcasts have a brilliant future. I think people who can figure out how to use AI in an intelligent way, controlling the quality of the information, but making use of the speed of analysis and access, have a great future. I think that there's a great unknown future. What beast is coming around the corner that we don't know yet. I think that companies like Politico and ED News honestly have an excellent future, notwithstanding the attack underway by the Trump administration now, the efforts to hurt us financially. A company like Politico and E&E that provides smart, timely, insightful information and depends on not advertisers but on subscribers, I think that's a still going concern. I think a newspaper that's printed on a printing press that relies on advertising from car dealership or others will have a much harder time of it.
Interesting. And I think as a last question coming up on time, if you had, one message, one thought you would like to leave with like the upcoming youth, how to deal with the future, everything that's going on, what would that be?
Keep the faith, baby. I mean, there's immense opportunities coming. And I'd come back to the genius of the podcast like this and others is that it's taking a form that didn't exist. You tell me, when did podcasts start becoming a thing?
Oh, I don't know. I started listening to, I think, my first podcast probably around like 2018 or 2016, probably around like the first Trump era.
Okay, so I'd be interested to see a bell curve to see the rise of podcasts and their number. I think they may have peaked in terms of numbers a couple of years ago, and there was some consolidation. But my message would be: look at the rise of technology or a platform like podcasting, and see how it's provided opportunities for people in this room and outside of this room to learn and to be entertained. And so, even if the podcasts are not your thing, they exemplify that there's new developments all the time. Mm-hmm. So I would say my message to the youth of today is to be forward-looking at all times and have a cheerful heart as you take on these tremendous challenges.
All right, well, adjunct professional lecturer, Micheal Doyle, thank you very much for coming on. And thank you, listener, for listening.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.